Good afternoon. This is Teaching Committee meeting Monday. Environment and Service. We have Chris Kaler up.
Mayor Jaworski, Members Council, staff, ladies and gentlemen. Jeff Shane and I are here to provide a brief overview on winter operations of 2018 to 2019. Transportation staff performed winter control duties commencing on November the 2nd at 11 p.m. and our shifts ended April 5th at 11 p.m. The weather. November was a challenge for us with over 20 centimeters of snow falling the week of November 11th, right in the middle of leaf collection. December, however, had low snowfall and warmer temperatures than normal. When we moved into 2019, January saw an average month for precipitation but had varying temperatures. And February, we had every type of precipitation imaginable, from ice pellets to freezing rain to snow, and no freeze-thaw cycle. March came in like a lion and left like a lion. April was cold and rainy, and I don't think we need to talk about May. As you can see, for the past calendar years, staff has spent almost all of our budget for winter control. Based on the figures to date for 2019, it is likely that we will be over budget for this year unless we have a very mild November and December. From mid-November to the end of March, we operate staff around the clock 7 days a week. This 13 zones with 14 trucks, which we are looking to increase to 14 zones and 15 trucks in 2019-2020. Additional plow trucks will be required to ensure vehicles are available for all routes. Since we are a 24-hour operation, the vehicles see a lot of use, and keeping them up and running can be a challenge. For the staff performing winter duties, there are regulations with respect to hours of work. Drivers can only drive for 13 hours, be on duty for 14 hours, and have a minimum of 10 hours off between shifts. If we have an event over 24 hours, we can struggle to get the staff in the vehicles based on their time off requirements. In addition to the equipment shown, we do have 5 contract snowblowers to assist us during heavy snowfalls for the cul-de-sacs and radius corners on crescents. Our salt shed is fairly new, and here are some photos, and thanks to Keshwar for posting them on Twitter so that the public could see what our salt shed looks like. So over the years, we've used a good amount of salt, but you can see that during 2016 to 2018, we are much lower than we were between 2013 and 2015. This was our first year to declare a snow event where we did not allow any on-street parking for a 24-hour period. This allowed staff to clear the roads without having to maneuver through the parked cars. The event in February was actually extended to 60 hours to ensure that we had all the streets cleaned. For this season, there were many challenges. Weather patterns are changing each year. We dealt with significant snow in the second week of November, where we needed to remove the leaf boxes in order to salt, and then we had to transition back to the leaf collection. We have the same trucks and staff performing both leaf pickup and winter operations. The events during the month of February were a challenge, as one event lasted for 3 days. Managing staff time in the trucks, expectations of the residents, and the lack of salt deliveries made it a difficult month. We follow the maintenance standards set out by the province, and in May of 2018, changes were made that required increased service levels for various items. Each street within the city is given a road class based on the speed limit and volume of traffic. Regional roads, city arterials, and bus routes all receive top priority. Cul-de-sacs are the last on the list to be completed, and we have 24 hours after the snow has stopped to clear the roads, assuming that we have had more than 10 centimeters of snowfall. We can leave 10 centimeters of snow on the Class 5 roads, but we rarely do so. Class 4 and 5 roads also do not require clearance to the curb, providing 5 meters down the middle of the road is acceptable for snow clearance. Now I'll pass it over to Jeff for Environment and Parks information.
Thank you, Chris, and good afternoon, Henry, Mr. Mayor, and members of council. I'll be reviewing as quickly as I can the winter sidewalk and trail operations that Environment and Parks Services is responsible for. Of the approximately, can I advance the slide, that would help. Of the approximately 550 kilometers of sidewalk within Waterloo, we currently maintain about 100 kilometers of that, so slightly under a fifth. We also maintain 19 kilometers of multi-use trail, 3.6 kilometers of segregated bike lanes, as well as 40 kilometers of park pathways. And I just wanted to mention, Chris was mentioning the weather and the impact of that early November storm, and I still have staff picking up leaves as a result of that today. So our winter maintenance activities take place throughout trails and sidewalks, and the following slide indicates the areas that we are assigned staff to. We obviously don't do all of the sidewalks. To do this, we utilize 8 trackless units, 3 plow trucks, 1 loader, 2 tractors with salters, and a whole lot of determination, dedication, and hard work. We run 3 shifts during the week, Monday through Friday, and on the weekends, 2 shifts. The city's current criteria for snow plowing operations on sidewalks and trails is an accumulation of 5 centimeters of snow or greater, and for salting, less than 5 centimeters of accumulation or in response to icy conditions. Our winter maintenance criteria exceeds that of the provincial minimum maintenance standards, which is a set criteria of 8 centimeters of accumulation. For the 2018-2019 winter season, we continued the Uptown King Street pilot project. The purpose of the pilot, as you'll recall, was to assist store owners with snow clearing of the newly completed streetscape, which included wider sidewalks, bike lanes, furniture zones, plantings, etc. in the Uptown core. And store owners remain responsible to clear the 1.5 meter of sidewalk fronting their properties. City staff were responsible for snow clearing and salting to widen the sidewalks, as well as snow loading and removal off-site as needed, and increase snow clearing at main intersections and pedestrian crossings. The pilot has been relatively successful, I would say, and we plan to continue this winter operation into the next season. Looking ahead for the 2019-2020 winter season, we are preparing to run a trail sweeping pilot project. And the purpose of this pilot is to improve service levels on our main, most heavily used trails, to better assist when we have minor non-threshold accumulations, or 5 centimeters or less, and to potentially use less salt. However, that's to be determined. The pilot To run the pilot, we will be repurposing an older trackless unit, which was scheduled for surplus, and we tend to keep one surplus unit in the inventory each winter already. And staff will monitor the winter program and will come back with recommendations based on our findings and customer feedback. The city receives a number of calls and inquiries, as I'm sure all of you know. This is a simple list of some of the more common ones. I won't go through all the list with you, but I did want to highlight 3 themes. The first one being timing. So there's a lot of questions on typically the question of when will the operations start and when will they finish. The second theme would be service levels. We continue to educate on our service levels, and although most are satisfied with their responses, not everyone will be. We have a number of complaints from the public with expectations of clear, dry pavement. However, we also have a number of concerns that come forward relating to over-salting and using too much salt, and sort of finding that balance with keeping us safe and protecting our environment as well. And to me, that's a great indication that our messaging is getting out there to our residents. And overall, I believe we have a very well-educated public who recognize that it is a balance. And the last theme I wanted to mention is something I refer to as the edges. There are a lot of different people involved in snow operations. This includes municipal staff, regional staff, private, commercial, and residential contractors, as well as all of the different property owners across the city. Where one group's area of responsibility meets another's is often where we run into problems, such as windrows, snow storage, freeze-thaw, puddling, ponding, freezing overnight, those kinds of issues. This issue is becoming greater as we continue to intensify and as our land resources become more scarce. There's more people in smaller areas all working to clear snow operations, where all of those activities come together can be problematic. Communication between the various stakeholders is obviously important, as is recognizing and including the operating cost when new trails, bike lanes, etc. are added, and designing these assets with maintenance in mind. We live in a 4-season climate that includes winter. The snow has to go somewhere. The most efficient and effective projects are those that are designed with winter operations in mind. And with that, I'll pass it on to Shane.
Thanks, Jeff, and through you, Chair Henry. To no surprise, my piece of this is the sidewalk bylaw piece. And so what I'll do is just briefly explain probably the 2 key pieces of of our bylaw, which is the standard itself and the time frame that accumulations of ice and snow must be removed to full width and down to concrete within 24 hours of the end of a snowfall. The challenge that we face many winters, but we found this past winter, is with the issue of multiple snowfalls. If we have a second event, snowfall, or in this case we had a lot of freezing rain as well, if those events occur before the first 24-hour period expires, then that clock resets, that 24-hour compliance resets. So the typical enforcement process, and I will highlight the word typical, is that upon receipt, a complaint is inspected within 2 business days. Now that's obviously dependent on volumes and scheduled cleanups that can take away from staff time. There's a 24-hour compliance period, so if there's a violation, a notice is left at the door requesting 24 hours or compliance within 24 hours. The reinspection process typically would take place within 2 days of the end of the compliance period. If the order is not complied, then the officer coordinates a cleanup at the owner's expense, and we use an outside contractor to do this. And I will reiterate that our current process is we have 2 staff on duty from December to March. It's staggered a bit, so we have 1 officer in December and 1 officer in March, but in the throughout January and February, the two officers are on. So we have coverage for that 4-month period, sometimes one dedicated officer and sometimes two. And again, I will say that I will indicate that this is a typical enforcement process, but we found that, whenever possible, and if the circumstances fit, we're there within 1 business day, but many times with higher volumes and weather conditions, it's longer than the 2-day period. And that's part of a review that I'll be talking about in a few minutes. Our statistics, I'm sorry for the font, but on your computer screens, you'll be able to see that over the last 3 years, the number of complaints received has increased substantially from last winter to this winter. The number of orders issued has increased, and the number of cleanups fluctuates. And the number of cleanups that happen, cleaned up by our contractor in charge to the property taxes or the tax roll of the owners, is dependent on the level of compliance. So the challenges, both my predecessors had indicated that this past winter was a challenge. There were several things that impacted the enforcement program for sidewalk clearing. Severe weather conditions and fluctuations in temperatures, the freeze-thaw cycle, so we would get sun shining in the daytime, we get some thaw, and then it would freeze overnight again. We had constant ice buildup, making cleanups for citizens as well as our contractors extremely difficult at times. Several freezing rain events. I referred to the difficulty in removing ice because of the thickness of the ice, and of course we had to be considerate of safety concerns both for inspection staff and contractors, but also we had received some concerns from residents who were saying, I'm trying to do this, but it's a significant safety concern for me. I need more time and that sort of stuff. So, we blend that into the way we respond. We have a contractor. Interesting to note that we've only been able to secure one contract and one bid for the last couple of years in terms of people wanting to private contractors wanting to engage in this business. The contractor this year, through what we believe no fault of his own, experienced challenges with workload and timing, in the sense that a cleanup of snow that might take, or hard packed snow that might take an hour or so, now we're talking about several hours and repeat visits for 2 and 3 inches of ice that had to be salted and chipped away and salted and chipped away and such. So again, the contractor availability is something we're going to be looking at. The third piece is something in terms of our tracking of complaints and the calls for service and our complaints management system. We realized that it wasn't working the way it was intended to, and we found that particularly when a snow event or when a snowfall came, and then we received another event before, within that time period or before others were inspected, the tracking system had, in some of the properties, reduced their priority. So in other words, some complaints that came in earlier had received less of a priority than above, or than the ones that came in recently. And quite simply, that shouldn't have happened. We need to do better, and we're committed to doing better in sorting that out. And that, I know that various members of council had received complaints and indications that it was taking long for property addresses to be inspected, and that's a piece of it. It's not everything, but it is certainly a piece of it, and I'm here to simply say that should not have happened, and we're gonna work towards ensuring that it doesn't happen in the future. So moving forward, it's been a while since this bylaw and process has been reviewed. Certainly, this will be coming up will be my 4th winter here, and it was previous to that. I think Shamir said perhaps 2013 or 14, maybe even earlier. So we've initiated a program to review not just the bylaw standards, but our process as well. And the three large buckets of areas that we're going to take a look at is the complaints management system that I just talked about. We want to take a look at the bylaw standards. And to that end, the issue that we have with the bylaw standard is that the way it's worded, the bylaw requires that snow and ice be cleared right down to the bare concrete, and sometimes that can be a challenge. And quite simply, in extreme weather, it's very difficult and almost impractical. And there's times as well when it's even large corporations, municipalities, and the ones that we've talked about sometimes are challenged to meet that standard as well. So we want to take a look at that. The problem that we run into is if you don't have a quantitative standard like bare concrete, then it becomes a discretionary issue, and that becomes a challenge as well. So there's challenges on both sides of developing that standard. We're also going to look at resource allocations and the availability of contractor services. We know what our budget is for the dedicated staff over the winter months, and we're going to work towards seeing what availability we have to increase our resource allocations to provide a better response. Maybe have dedicated services so that we don't have officers doing 3 or 4 different things, and let staff focus on certain for areas like first response to a complaint. Another focus on the cleanups after the fact and such. So we will be apprising council of any recommendations that come out for program or come forward with program improvements. If an issue has to come to council, certainly there'll be a council report. Otherwise, if these are all the recommendations can be implemented by staff without a council decision necessary, we will still ensure that council is made aware of the program improvements prior to the winter season, which according to right now, maybe just around the corner. So I'll leave it at that. I believe we're open for questions now. Sorry, Christine. Christine has a couple of closing comments.
So I'm sure that you've all received complaints about winter control at one point or another. So we thought we'd share a couple of the compliments. So we had a resident from Lynbrook Place indicate that the driver did an excellent job on clearing the circle, and that driver to come back and do his street every time. This picture was taken from someone on their bicycle in the middle of winter, saying that, and you can see the track list in the background, apologized for the quality of the photo. We know that he was taking it while he was riding. Another thank you was from a gentleman that lives near Sandown, and our park staff helped them with some salt. And another cul-de-sac where they were thanking us for taking away the snow very quickly. And from Cycle Waterloo Region, they provided park staff with individual thank you cards. And I think that concludes our presentation. We'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Method.
If it is a cul-de-sac, we will blow the snow onto the area. If there is sometimes and as quickly as possible, and sometimes we'll have to come back afterwards and clean up.
to and I'm just wondering if it's more than or a choice we've made.
Roads are held to the standard that the ministry provides us with. So we have to clear streets in the amount of that are main are the roads in which we get for 2019, 2020. 15 trucks and 14 routes.
How much the uptown pilot cost?
We pulling some other areas. Here, so that we had to pull some seasonal forward to deal not only with this pilot specifically, but with the LRT impacts as well. There's an impact of that on the horticulture program later in the summer.
Okay, thank you. And you said that there are, you have your team picking up leaves right now. Where? How?
Sorry. Yeah, that wasn't actually part of my presentation. I just thought of it as Chris was talking about it. So all of those leaves that got missed in November, not all of them, but a large amount of them that got missed in November, they sat there all winter and they composted down really nicely. And we had a couple areas throughout the city, cul-de-sacs actually, where there was a large amount of leaf debris still sitting there. So we had to get staff out to get out and get that loaded up and removed. And we're going to have to go back again and be reseeding because all those leaves composted through the winter and killed off a lot of the grass as well.
Okay, thanks. I'll know where to direct all those emails. And then Shane, and then one last just overall question. Do you have complaint data by election year? Because one of the things that we've talked about is that as new councillors come on, you might receive more complaints. Just people hoping that you're going to be the one to get the job done. So I'm just curious if there's any data about that.
Through you, Chair Henry, I'll say that we have the data. We haven't pulled it that way. But that is something that we could do if required. But we don't poll according to election years, because that might be a slope we don't want to go down.
Right.
But certainly, we could do it.
Sure. No, I'm not asking for that. I was just curious if you had it offhand. Okay, and then overall, I think you all kind of touched on this briefly in your presentations, but one of the ways that I'd really love to start thinking about snow removal, I know you're already thinking about it, but just really front of mind is in terms of isolation. And so I think that's the big thing we're hearing is people feeling the advocacy for the sidewalk snow removal entirely being done by the city and in a like in a really robust way so that it works, is because people are experiencing isolation during the winter months. So the bus routes, even though they're priority, there are some times when they're not cleared very well. I take the bus, and I know that firsthand as well, and I'm fully able-bodied, and for now, and so I just wanted to kind of say, I hope that we can start kind of talking about that, like making that a priority to talk about as we're having these conversations, is what does this mean for reducing isolation in our community and increasing belonging, thinking about the Waterloo Wellbeing Survey. Yeah, comments would be great, but.
Sure. Through you, Chair Henry, there's a couple of comments that I would make that's not just on sidewalks, but it might, that's where my headspace is. And one, you mentioned the social inclusion as being one of the pillars of the Wellbeing Waterloo Region framework in terms of ensuring that neighbors are connected and watching out for each other. So I think there's some work to be done there now. I also believe that this is something that we can connect into our neighborhood strategy in terms of feeling like you're part of the community. And certainly when I know there's many municipalities, I won't go too far into length at this, but some people have heard me say there's many municipalities in Ontario that don't have snow clearing sidewalk bylaws, and they still figure it out. And sometimes it's because they know that they can't call somebody else, so they figure it out and they work with their neighborhoods to get it done. And I think that's part of a piece that we could build into the neighborhood strategy.
Councillor Bodley.
Through you, Chair Henry, I might piggyback on what Jen was talking, Councillor Bassick, was talking about there, but I have a couple of questions, I guess, first. For Chris, I guess. So one of the things that I often, first of all, thank you very much for responding to all of the questions that I asked, the numerous questions throughout the season, and responding very professionally. I'm sure at points in time on my time here, short time on council, when finding out that I have to add that the question I have is for you, I'm like, oh my God, she's going to hate me because I keep asking her question after question after question. So thank you very much for that. But a lot of the knowledge that you've imparted on me is around the minimum maintenance standards and understanding that. And I've been able to utilize that terminology when talking to residents about their specific roads when they have questions. So I understand that we have these maintenance standards as set out by the province. Do we have any internal goals for the various roads that say, okay, most residents would say to you 10 centimeters of accumulation on the road, although that's the minimum maintenance standard as set out by the province, that's not acceptable to most residents, I would suggest. And I understand that that's not our goal. And I'm curious if we need to set that out to say these are the minimum maintenance standards that we will meet, but these are the goals that we have for those roads.
Through you, Chair Henry, that's a difficult question because we know that on a Class 5 cul-de-sac that we can leave 10 centimeters of snow on that cul-de-sac. Do we leave 10 centimeters of snow? No. But we also realize that we can't always have it down to the asphalt. So it has to be a balance in between the number that the province has given us and black pavement. So I think we do a really good job of trying to meet that middle ground, wherever that may be. Some seasons it's easier than others, depending on the types of precipitation we're getting. So if we'd had just snow all winter, we probably would have had black asphalt everywhere. But when we have the mixed events, it makes it more difficult for us.
So yeah, so just some food for thought. And again, the idea of having internal goals does not necessarily mean that we're going to achieve those goals all the time, for sure. But the idea of having internal goals might be something that we can go to residents and instead of saying we can leave 10 centimeters on your road, so you should be happy with where it is, we can say, we can leave 10 centimeters on the road. Our city goal is 5 centimeters or whatever it is. So just something to think about in terms of the framing of the discussion with residents, not necessarily that we would be obligated to it. Next question, sorry, through you, Chair Henry, is, so the budget that was referenced at the beginning of the presentation was $1.8 million. Is that the budget specifically for roads, or does that also include parks in the bylaw piece as well?
Through you, Chair Henry, it's specifically for transportation. I did not include my friends with their costs.
So as a follow-up then, do we have a budget specifically for the Parks Department and for bylaw in terms of what we spend on sidewalk clearing currently for trails, sidewalks and pathways, and also for enforcement?
Through you, Chair Henry, our expenses relating to this program are primarily wages, since any work that city crews do to clear sidewalks are billed back to the taxpayer or to the tax rolls and are recoverable. So that's a recoverable item. So our budget is somewhere in the range of about $22,000 per winter for the salary and benefits of those two officers.
Through the chair to the councillor, similar to Shane's comment, my costing is a lot of it blended in with other areas. I can get you those numbers. I don't have them with me at this time.
Okay, appreciate that. Thank you. So before I go into a conversation about sidewalk clearing, I just want to clarify the bylaw and maybe use an example. So the issue, I guess, with the way that the bylaw is currently constructed, and it's not necessarily a criticism of it in comparison to other bylaw, it's just I'm looking at it. So if I'm a person who is a senior or who has mobility issues, or I walk to school, I'm a single mother who's walking to school with a stroller, and there's unfortunately not a neighborly person who has decided that they're not going to clear their sidewalk. So I go out the first day, maybe I'm just frustrated and I don't say anything about it. It's already been 24 hours since the snowfall anyways, so that's one day. Then the first day, I don't say anything, so that's the second day. Then we have 1 to 2 days to go out there, so that's 4 days. You can see where I'm going. I won't go through the whole thing, but by the time we get to the end of this process, it's 9 days since the snowfall. And I think this is where the frustration comes in from residents, particularly who have mobility issues. So is it fair to say that at some point in time, if a resident is complaining, it could be 9 days since the last snowfall before we're getting to the point where we're actually out there doing something?
Through you, Chair Henry, to Councillor Bodley, that's exactly correct. When you think in terms of immediate safety concerns, the bylaw doesn't go as far as many people would like it to see in terms of alleviating an immediate safety issue. Our clock, if I can use that analogy, our clock starts ticking when we receive the complaint. And typically we won't receive a complaint until at least 1 day, but it could be several days. But even if it's at 1 day and a couple of days for enforcement, re-inspections, sidewalk cleanup, we could be into 7 days. And that's for non-compliance. The ideal scenario is we do an inspection, leave a notice, and the property owners comply, which is something that happens regularly as well. And it's the bad spots that highlight the timeframes. The one point and we will look at the time frame issue and see what flexibility there might be in the bylaw, but it's predicated on one issue, and that is a municipality's ability to go onto private property or go onto a sidewalk and do work and then bill it to the taxes of that property owner against their will, quite frankly. It's all dependent upon the ability or the lack of compliance from somebody complying with something or failing to do something they were directed to do. In other words, they have to be given an opportunity before we can, before the city crews on any type of bylaw that we have can go onto their property or onto their sidewalks and then bill their taxes against their will. So we have to balance that, the time frame piece and the safety issue, with the fact that we have to give a time for compliance.
Certainly, and I think as we now I'm going to just lead into my final thing around around sidewalk clearing in general. I guess I think this is exact as other municipalities are talking about proactive bylaw enforcement. This is exactly the argument for why it's really not going to be successful, because there are some I've referenced this before in talking to people. This is a link in the chain issue. If one person doesn't do their job, the whole road is not navigable or difficult to navigate for, again, some of our most vulnerable people. And to Jen's point, or to Councillor Rassick's point around social isolation, as part of our strat plan, we're talking about an aging population. I think there's a huge part of it from that perspective. There's a lot of data out there that says that women are statistically less likely to drive than men, so this is a gender gap question as well too. And frankly, I think our current system sort of prioritizes our transportation systems when I'm, notwithstanding getting the information from Jeff regarding the budget on parks, 22K in bylaw versus 1.8 million in transportation is pretty significant. And for me, I look at this argument as, the way a city is operating, what priorities a city has is based on how we take care of our most vulnerable. And to me, I don't think we're doing a great job of that at this point in time. The Canadian, there's a health organization out there that has put out information that says that we have 9,000 hospitalizations in 2016-17 winter season due to ice falls in Canada, which is more than double the amount of hospitalizations related to people playing hockey, skating, skiing, and snowboarding, snowmobiling, and tobogganing combined. So this is a huge public health issue from my perspective, and I understand that public health is not necessarily under the purvey of the city, but if we're not taking into account those costs, then I think we're missing the boat a little bit there. So from my perspective, I would like to have a more robust conversation at some point in time about doing a pilot project on sidewalk clearing in a neighborhood. I understand that we're not going to get it right necessarily every single time, and I guess we don't get it right every single time necessarily, or at least in the eyes of residents, we don't get it right every single time in our transportation clearing, but that shouldn't be the reason why we don't do it. So I'll just leave my thoughts there on that. Thank you.
And continuing on with questions, I have Councillor Hammer.
Thank you. Through you, actually, Councillor Bodley did ask a number of my questions, and I'll help you out with the Institute. It's CIHI, the Canadian Institute for Health Informatics. That's okay. I, too, just want to say to Chris, thank you very much for answering the multitude and plethora of questions, it seemed, on my part of when is my little street going to be done. I think my neighborhood is full of, my whole ward is full of the small cul-de-sacs, so it's never where it should be. I also agree, though, that maybe we should look at how we're telling the story, and it would be kind of nice to be able to say this might be the standard, here's our goal. It changes the dialogue with the residents if we can say, you know what, we're hitting our goal, or this is what we're trying to do, rather than going back to say this is what our standard is. So I would echo the encouragement to look at how we're telling that story. Certainly helps us maybe reduce the number of complaints we might get. Thanks.
Other questions from members of council on this perennial topic that we tend to get? No, I appreciate all staff coming in. I think to Councillor Bodley's point on this, I think not necessarily using the right comparators of using Shane's department. I think the right comparators is Jeff's department, because it's about a clearing service, which is transportation and EPS, not about the enforcement resources. But I think, Mr. Turner, one of the things that I would suggest from what I'm hearing around the table that you ought to be cautious about in the review is if you do land on the place where additional resources in terms of enforcement resources are desired, it would be helpful to consider that request in the broader context of whether that's where council would best prefer to spend resources, whether incremental resources should land on enforcement or whether incremental resources should land on clearing more snow, more better in more places to help bring some connection. So if there are some recommendations that come out there, I think we've got some value questions that are more at the council level than can be dealt with just internally to a division. And so I'd encourage staff to think that way when these are happening. And I appreciate seeing that there are some pilot projects and some increments to service that are proposed or coming for the 219-220 winter season. I think those will be helpful to understand how they work. So, seeing nobody else on this issue at this time, appreciate the presentations and the information. I think it's helpful if you could circulate the PowerPoint presentation to all of us that you made. That would be good. There was information in there that I learned, and I wasn't going to snap photos of the screen while we were doing it. So I'd appreciate having the PowerPoint. There are no delegations. That brings us to consent motion. Anybody have anything specific underneath that? Seeing none, I'll look for a mover of the consent motion. Mayor Jaworski, Councillor Veith, all those in favor? That's all of us. Next, we're on to staff reports. And we have the asset management tax-based report cards. I think for some people, May is a month early for report card season. But here we are. I understand we're getting further report cards in June. Take it away, Cass.
We are. Chair Henry, Mayor, members of Council, thank you for having me here today to share the Transportation and Facilities report cards. The report before Council today provides a look at the City of Waterloo's first set of asset management report cards. In addition to providing a few highlights of the report cards, I will outline some key assumptions and plans for future report cards. The first assumption is asset maturity considerations, which is related to the availability and quality of the data. Some asset classes have been collecting and reporting on their inventory and condition for several years, while some other areas are relatively new to the process. For the two asset groups included in this report, transportation assets are considered to have a high maturity, while facilities are considered to have a medium maturity. It's important to remember that asset management is relatively new, and as the city gains more experience and knowledge, the maturity of the information will improve and that the estimated costs may be adjusted. So in regards to the asset or the funding assumptions and the levels, the funding levels used in both the report cards and the decision support system are reflective of the rehabilitation or replacement costs, which is funded primarily from the Capital Infrastructure Reinvestment Reserve Fund, also known as CIRF. Funding from development charges or CRF, Capital Reserve Fund, are excluded as they are used to fund growth or studies. The next few slides will share some highlights from the transportation report card, which includes roads, sidewalks, trails, and trail links. The current value of that collective grouping of assets is $769 million, and it's anticipated that the average funding of $3.3 million will result in conditions for that transportation network declining to a level that's anticipated to be unacceptable to most stakeholders. As you may recall, the graph before you is one of the key outputs that we can generate from our decision support system. This particular chart is reflective of our transportation network assets and is based on the 2019 to 2028 capital budget. Based on this information, staff are able to identify that the city has approximately 5% of transportation assets that are in very poor condition, so the red bars on the graph. Based on projected funding from the capital budget and aggregation curves, we are able to project that almost 75% of transportation assets will be in very poor condition by 2043. The city evaluates the condition of roads using Pavement Quality Index, or PQI, on a scale of 0 to 100, with roads with a rating of 80 or above are considered to be in excellent condition, while roads with a PQI of 20 or below are considered to be in very poor condition. The target condition for each road segment varies based on road classification. Larger volume roads have a higher target condition. For example, arterial and collector are deemed replacement candidates when their PQI falls below 45, while local or rural roads, when their PQI falls below 40, is when they're considered a rehabilitation candidate. Their average annual funding gap for transportation is determined between a comparison of the budget scenario and the target scenario. The budget scenario is created using the asset condition as well as projected funding and aggregation curves, while the target scenario is based on the targeted levels of service. Using this approach, the transportation assets have an estimated $15.1 million annual infrastructure funding gap, with $14 million of that for roads and the rest split between sidewalks and trails. Similar to the last few slides, the next few will focus on the highlights from the facilities report card. One area to highlight in this report card is that it's to focus on a tax-based supported assets such as City Hall, the Button Factory, and the main library. Facilities funded by enterprise operations such as the Parkade, Parkview Cemetery, or sanitary pumping stations are excluded and funded through their own enterprise areas. As a result, the current value of tax-based supported funding facilities is $268 million and is supported by an average annual funding level of $2.8 million. Similar to transportation assets, it is anticipated that facility asset condition will decline over the next 25 years. Similar to the transportation graph, you can see before you that almost 20% of facility assets are deemed to be in poor condition, very poor condition. And by 2043, almost 40% will be in very poor condition. Similar to transportation, the average annual funding gap is determined between that comparison between the budget scenario and the target scenario. Using this approach, facility assets have an estimated $1.5 million average annual infrastructure funding gap. So upcoming reports. If this report before you today is approved, staff will prepare report cards for more asset classes over the next few years, using the same methodology and format as the transportation facilities report cards. The next set of report cards is proposed to be tabled at the June FSP meeting and reflect city utility assets. These assets includes water distribution, sanitary collection, and stormwater. Report cards for other asset classes such as fire services, parking, parks, bridges, information technology will be developed and tabled before council over time until we reach December 2022. That concludes today's presentation. Thank you again. Together with subject matter experts from engineering, transportation, and facilities, we are happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Cass, for those report cards. It looks like our forecasted grades are getting less good by the year. As a reminder, Council, and as Cass mentioned at the end, the asset managers are here to be able to answer questions not just about the reports and the data that went in, but to help Council understand how it is that the city does do the maintenance that is built into these report cards behind the scenes as well. Since I know we are not experts, that's why we pay experts, but sometimes it's useful to know. We recorded some Saturday morning cartoon notes about that. Questions from Council? Councillor Bartley.
Within the transportation division, so one of the things that was noted was that, through you, Chair Henry, one of the things that was noted was that the annual gap has increased to $15.1 million since the 2016 asset management plan. And it says due to inventory and cost estimate updates. And I'm wondering if maybe you can just elaborate on that to explain a little bit more detail what that means and how we make sure that that isn't going to continue to increase when we're looking at this 3 years from now.
Through you, Chair Henry, to Councillor Bodley. So what that means is that we actually took our decision support system and we created a direct link to our GIS system. So anytime there's a new road added or something happens on a road, such as we do in another pavement management analysis, we'll get the updates fairly quickly. And there was a little bit of a gap in between the 2015 information going into 2016. So we just did a more comprehensive inventory. So we have that, so it's great. And the asset condition and the cost. So as the cost goes up, when we're tendering it, we'll be able to update it. If we're lucky enough that the costs ever go down, then that would naturally decrease the gap. Can I promise that the gap will not get larger? No, because it's dependent on the funding that's available to assign to roads. And the freeze thaw doesn't help because then the roads get more potholes. And the more that we assign funding to not being preventative and we have to let the roads go to reconstruction is a lot more expensive. So if we can be more proactive on some of this, then that could save us some money in the long run.
Appreciate that. And through you, Chair Henry, just one last one if I could. And this is maybe more of a suggestion, particularly in the transportation side, like the PQI target is something that's interesting to me. And I'm wondering if, as part of the transportation report card, we could see an image of what the difference is between an 80 and a 60 and a 40 road based on PQI. And I wonder when we're going out to the public to talk about how we're going to pay for all this stuff, whether that would be relevant to understand what the expectation from the public is on these roads, to be able to give an example and not just use sort of a random number.
Through you, Chair Henry, to Councillor Bodley. So the idea of the image is something I was actually pondering for the asset management plan. The report card is pretty limited unless we start expanding it beyond 2 pages, but it is something I was looking at, and something I actually did see that another municipality, when I was at a conference last week, is already doing, and I thought that was a great idea, so I'd like to rip off and duplicate. But in regards to what the public thinks, I'm going back a few years, but the engineering department a few years ago did a focus group to determine what the public understood. And so what they deemed acceptable was less than what we, it was higher than, or less is the opposite. We were maintaining it better than they thought, but it takes a lot of work to understand and get them to understand. And I mean, Christine might be able to answer on the types of complaints we're getting on potholes, but because that will help.
Other questions from Councillor Vasic?
Thanks for the presentation. I think the report card look amazing. And I appreciate your answers to some of my technical questions that I didn't reply to yet. And I mean, I think this really makes a case in the public for focusing on this is just a comment really, not a question, but for really focusing on active transportation. I mean, this is a huge gap and it will continue to grow, and roads cost a lot of money to repair, and there are heavy machines driving on them as climate change continues to wreak havoc on everything, including our roads. I mean, these report cards could also, I think, enhance a case for really promoting public transportation and investing our funds there as well. So thanks I don't know if it would have been brought to light without these report cards. They're really useful data.
The trails are flat, the roads are bumpy. Is that the Vasic path forward? The trails are smooth, the roads are bumpy? You can take that if that is bold, Councillor Vasic. That is very bold. Other questions from Council? I think just so Council has same answers and information that I know I have from serving as Council's rep on the asset management steering committee. I've had more opportunities before today to look at some of this and ask staff some of these. So, Cass, when we look at the reporting target of the overall network PQI of 60. Not the most meaningful, bit of data in terms of helping to understand how the city functions, right? Because as we add new roads, well, each new road is 100, but that doesn't tell us much about the broader network. So can you tell us where these overall targets are coming from and why these are standing out? But we'll start there.
I think I'm actually going to defer this to Ron.
That's great. See, I see Ron sitting back there, and I knew we needed to do something to get the folks that were here to come up to the podium.
Yeah, good afternoon, Chair Henry and members of council. Yeah, the PQI is, it's a number that I think on one hand is very useful because it's derived very scientifically. We actually hire a consultant who has a van that's instrumented with a lot of sensors and equipment, and they generate numbers for comparison for different pavement conditions across the city's network. But on the other hand, as council are noting, to the average person, it's not necessarily a useful indicator. And I'll give you an example. A brand new road that's paved, one would think it actually has a PQI of 100. And that is the case for about 6 to 8 months until it needs to be crack sealed, because even then, our sophistication of our PQI metrics and with the asset management plan already starts to depreciate that asset, even when one would think it's brand new and it's going to stay brand new for a while. So I think there is some subjectivity here to the number. I think 60 is probably the right number to use based on what Cassandra mentioned in terms of people's perceptibility. But I would agree with council's observations from road to road specifically. It may not be the most useful comparator. But right now, for a dashboard number, it is very useful to give us indications citywide as a target. So the ideas about photographs, about perhaps some other descriptive ways to explain the PQI is something I think staff can take away, and if council would like to see that, I think that's something we could generate.
And I think I'm seeing some nods. I think that's helpful. I mean, among the things that we've talked about is the difference between technical levels of service, which are those datums that we're collecting that our technical folks need to be able to procure the right thing at the right time and do the right thing in the right way, and that we also need to report under the regulation of the ministry. But that doesn't help, the average person on the street taking a look at it, understand what we're trying to do and what we've done, which I think are classified under community levels of service. They're accessible language around trying to get places. One of the reasons we have a priority around clearing arterial roads of snow in the winter is if you want the ambulance to get into your house, most of the travel is going to be on those main roads, and it's going to do that a lot faster if they're clear. And the last little bit, it serves the capillaries in the blood network, and you want to make sure the major arteries are getting the blood through to the most places. So for the public, we set the same targets in the same way based on how many people are using a road, how many goods they're moving, how we're dealing with. So I think there's a level of descriptive things that connect with the images that is more helpful than saying 55. But 57, 57's great. 53 is really bad. We need to do something about it. That's not an accessible, illustration for the public. And I think council trying to have a debate about what to do about this gap doesn't help if we're debating whether 53 is the number or 57 is the number or 55 is the number. That's not really our level of expertise and our level of exposure. I think that the community analysis is the helpful one to look at.
Thank you. Through you, Chair Henry, to Ron. Just something that Councillor Henry said that sort of stuck for me. So, do we look at this from a target, 60 as the target, based on the kilometers of road average? Is that kind of how we look at it? And I wonder, is that basically saying that? I wonder if there's a better way to look at it in the sense that if 50% of our roads were a 0, or 50% of our roads were at 10, and 50% of our roads were at 100, we'd say, hey, everything's great, because we're averaging to 60. So I wonder if if we've thought about that, if that's the right way to look at it, or if there's a different way to look at it.
Through you, Chair Henry. Yeah, that's an excellent point, Councillor Bodley. I think there's probably many ways we could look at the number as an index. This one, over the years, has been one that we felt is, again, useful as a number that we can compare, so year to year, so we can track degradation, we can track improvement where we do get to improving roads and reconstructing them. Also, it's a methodology that's used in other municipalities, so we actually have a benchmark, against other municipalities to see where we sit, to make sure that we're not falling behind, or at least putting the right amount of resources to it. So, as Councillor Henry alluded to, it's one number. I think it's important to keep it in context, and you're right, as an average, to look at it sort of as an initial metric, but it's not one that we completely base our decision making on when we go in to reconstruct a road. It's a leading index for sure, but we also, as council knows, look at our underground infrastructure, and whenever we're making a decision to go in and look at an upgrade to any asset for that matter, we want to look at optimizing that dollar that goes into it. So the pavement quality indicators are one, but also the number of water main breaks, potholes, claims, drainage problems. There's a whole range of other factors that go into the mix that when council sees our annual and through our budgeting cycle prioritization of road projects, this is only one of the many metrics that goes into that. Yeah.
Seeing no further questions from council, thank you very much for bringing these forward. We'll look forward to seeing you back next month for some more report cards out of the utility section, which deals with many of the items Ron just talked about that go in with how we reconstruct roads. Next up, we need to provide direction on these set of items. Mayor Jaworski, seconded by Councillor Bodley. That's do some more report cards and keep doing them. I think the summary. All those in favor? That's carried. Next up, we have the allocation of the 2018 surplus. I know we have an introduction, but not a presentation from our CFO.
Thank you, Chair Henry. Through you to Mayor Jaworski and members of Council, I will just give a very brief overview of our 2018 year-end surplus. So this report before Council today, or before FSB, is comparing the budget to the actual results. There's a slightly different report that we will have in May, which will be the audited report, which is a very different basis. So just wanted to provide that in context, that this is really comparing actuals to budget. The surplus is roughly $3.6 million. Actually, I shouldn't say roughly, it is very precisely that, now that the books are almost finalized, subject to the audit. It is 3.5% of our operating budget. It is larger than in prior years. But it is important to note that this is largely a one-time surplus. So the details that are in this report indicate which ones are one-time, which ones are consistent, that we expect will reoccur. And finance staff do meet with the operating division directors every year as part of the budget process to work through those items and to make sure that we incorporate them into the budget process. So if it's a sustainable revenue source, it will get built into the budget. So this report outlines which ones have been built into the 2019 budget, and we're certainly looking at this report when we're doing the 3-year budget that's coming up too. One of the other points to note is one of the primary contributors of the surplus is in our corporate accounts. These do not belong to any department, and as an example, we have a much lower write-off of our property taxes resulting from decisions being made by the Assessment Review Board. So just compared to even last year, it was a $1.2 million reduction, which is significant. At the same time, this is not necessarily sustainable because we really don't know how many properties will be appealed, which ones will be successful, how long it will take. So there's so many variables that come into play. So that's the point that I'm making, is that it is one time and we cannot really count on this 3.6 being available every year. And details on the write-off with respect to the Assessment Review Board decisions, they are on page 111 of the packet. It is item 6H on the agenda, so there's more information in there with respect to those write-offs that are legislated. And the final point that I would make is that the surplus that we have, as per the policy, 50% goes to the Capital Infrastructure Rehabilitation Reserve, and 50% goes to the Tax Rate Stabilization Reserve. So by virtue of having this surplus, we are taking care of our investment, our reinvestment, and our rehabilitation needs, because the money is going into the CURF. That we have reserved that is specifically set up for rehabilitation. So the points that Cassandra was making with respect to the need that is there in roads, the more money we put in through CURF, through the surplus, it starts addressing some of those fundamental needs. And so with this, I will turn it over to Heidi if you have any other more detailed questions with respect to the surplus report.
And certainly these are one-time dollars going into the infrastructure piece. So as you've said, we can't count on this as a sustainable funding source. It's just making sure that we do allocate those when they come. Questions from council on the surplus deficit report? Seeing none, I'll look for a mover of following policy. Mayor Jaworski, Councillor Vasek, Councillor Freeman. No, sorry, I thought you were commenting. No, that you're thirding the motion. We're getting some fourth things and fifth things, and when I see that, that means we call the vote. All those in favor, and turns out that's all the hands. So that's very good. And I note and observe, just in retrospect, the tax rate stabilization, we passed some policy around capping how much that can accrue. So in the event it does top out, it does spill over into other accounts. So we've actually set up a good set of backstops in policy so that this one doesn't drive us into having way too much in TRS and not enough in other places. Next up is funding release, public engagement capacity initiative. I see Tony is available for questions. Do you have anything to say to us, Tony? Nope. Tony's available for questions. Questions from council? Councillor Freeman.
I just want to make sure that this allocation of resource is different than this whole branding thing that came up during the budget, that this is a separate process.
Through you, Chair Henry, to the councillor, it's absolutely a separate thing. Councillor Freeman, it's related strictly to IAP2 training.
Yeah, this one would come under, you would have seen Jim Bowman present to this item out of community services and respond to questions during the business plan, but per the report it got pulled up into communications because really it's a citywide need and citywide help. So did I get a mover for that? No. Then I'll look for Councillor Vasek, who loves public consultation, and Councillor Hanmer, who, really none of us are slouches on asking for more of this on that file. All those in favor? That's carried. That takes us to the wonderful world of policies, specifically policies related to the capital budget and capital overhead policy. I know Council had asked about these items during budget season, and staff indicated they were working on them, and here they are. And they've been to audit committee. Any questions for our illustrious staff team from finance, who I can kind of see through the clerks? Yeah. Seeing none, I'll look for a mover. Moved by Councillor Bodley, seconded by Councillor Freeman. With a question, or are you just good? Yeah. I thought so. Like, I kept looking. I was waiting for it.
I guess what I'm curious about is that if we find a different way of doing things, such that we're saving even more money, and or we find a different way of, say, I don't know, paving a road that saves money, how does that translate back into the budget based on the policies, for one thing, and how does it also translate into changing, say, the model assumptions within the asset management model?
So through Chair Henry to Councillor Freeman, there's two ways that we could have, let's say, a savings or a surplus. So if it's related to operating, it would come through the report that you just seen through an operating surplus, which would then be allocated 50-50 between CURF and tax rate STABE. If it's on the project side, so if we see savings as a result of projects for new methods or good tender pricing, it's returned to source. So it depends on how that project was initially funded, but let's say it's 100% CURF, the dollars will go back to CURF. The model doesn't factor in these items until they've come to fruition. So like what Kesher alluded to, the money that just got allocated to CURF through the operating surplus will be brought into the LTFP model through the CURF reserve as a one-time infusion. So it will help make a little bit of progress, but we don't build that in every year until it's thought to be sustainable. So we would treat it like a grant. The only grants that we have built into the model right now are the ongoing committed grants, which is the federal gas tax. Other grants such as CWWF, where we got a one-time infusion, once those are achieved, we build them in and we do see some benefit to the asset classes, but we don't bank on them until they come to fruition. So that is kind of how we would deal with surpluses.
And I know Cass has left, but I'd look to staff to correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's fair to say that because our asset management program and long-term financial program on top of that pulls data from our actual capital budgets and looks at the cost curves for all of our assets, if we see changes in either of those based on lower or higher costs, then those would work their way through the model because we're pulling in live data that's being updated. Is that fair, Mr. Rapp?
To Chair Henry, that's correct. So once the actual cash surplus comes forward and is assigned to an asset class, that's when it would make it to the analytical system and be updated, once it actually picks that one class of where the money goes to.
And if we were finding, a certain kind of project always came in 10% lower than it used to because we've done something different, the capital project sheets would get updated over time to reflect that through the budget process, and that would work its way into the system.
That too is correct. Thank you.
Yeah. I'm now seeing questions. So questions beget questions. Councillor Vasek.
Through you, Chair. Thanks. This is a question because I see that I was going to reply with another question to all the questions I sent you, and it did not go through. This is completely just like an I don't understand this question, which I try to ask behind the scenes. The 5.1%, so when you smooth something out, you just do smaller bits every year, so it's not like a giant hit one time. Is that right? So maybe you can explain to me, because I don't understand how 5.1% happens, and I don't understand how 2.94% happens.
So through Chair Henry to Councillor Vasek, the 5.18% Toronto Construction Price Index increase on a 12-month rolling average, that occurred. So that was the increase. The policy as written before the recommendation today with revisions, our policy would be to increase all capital projects by 5.18% every year. So just on the surface, if we took the dollars that are in the budget today and they would just all be increased, we wouldn't be able to do the same amount of projects with the same amount of dollars, as everything would just cost a lot more. So it highlighted potentially an issue in the policy where we're looking to smooth out those blips. As the inflationary increase is backwards looking, it's not necessarily a predictor of the future. So we're trying to smooth it out by using a 5-year average of the construction price index. So the 2.94 is the 5-year average of the last 5 years. And the way the policy is written is we'll do a rolling 5-year average, and then that's how we'll inflate capital moving forward. So we would anticipate that it will creep up a little bit in the coming years, as that 5.18% is going to be in the 5-year average for the next few years. But as you can see, back in 2014, it was 1.5%. So there's this indice, and we're looking to use an average out. So from one year to the next, we don't have wild swings within the capital budget. So that's when we refer to smoothing out the impact. That's what we're looking to do here.
If I can just add one little thing to Councillor Vasic. So if for the next 5 years going forward, it's 5% every year, because the cost escalation really is continuing and continuing and continuing, at some point, that's what the inflationary 5-year average smoothing will be, is 5. But we're saying, is it a 1 or 2 year thing, and then it's going to come down again, perhaps to 2% or 3%. Some years it's been 8 or 9%. And so we're trying not to pick one number and say, this is how we're going to now forecast the next 10 years based on that one number from the past year, and rather look at it in a longer term way, even though that itself is also not a perfect indicator of what's going to happen for the next 10 years. But we're going to be continuing to update the capital budget every 1 and 3 and 1 and 3, and so we'll kind of keep that in mind. But is there a perfect way to do it? No. We thought this was a more conservative approach than taking the one number and moving that forward. So hopefully that helps.
It's the equivalent of the great cauliflower scare of a couple of years ago, when people that never ate cauliflower were incensed by $6.50 heads of cauliflower that were going to ruin their family forever. And all adjust our budgets to that. I don't know. That one stuck out at me as a social media ridiculousness. I'm trying to be more accessible and down to earth these days. Well, I'm not succeeding a whole lot. Councillor Bodley?
I don't know how to follow that, to be honest with you, but through you, Chair Cauliflower. Wow, totally lost my train of thought there. But okay, so I'll try and bring it back here. If my question, I guess, is if the cauliflower scare is not really just a scare, and next year we see that cauliflower is still $6.50. I'm getting off this cauliflower. If next year the Q3 Toronto construction price index is also 5%, do we have to revisit this policy and say, maybe it is 5, and the idea that we're using a 5-year average is actually bringing it down and influencing our what we can do with our capital budget dollars 10 years out in a way that isn't feasible anymore. And maybe 2 years is not enough, but if this year it's 5 and next year it's 5 and the year after it's 5, do we need to come back and revisit that and say, you know what, it's probably 5?
So through Chair Henry to Councillor Bodley, the 5-year average will help us with the inflator. I think where we would capture the comment that you've just raised is we budget in base dollars or in current unit prices. So if the price of doing a said project has been going up by 5% year over year, we will have captured that, and we will reset the unit prices. Everything will cost more, and the dollars we have available will do less with the same amount of dollars. But that's how we would deal with that without having to make another policy change. An important comment, though, on what you just mentioned is that would lead into what Cass just talked about, is our gap would get worse just as a result of the unit prices going up. So we will see year over year changes without potentially changes in inventory, just if it costs more or less to replace the same amount of assets. So we would deal with it through base budgeting, and then this is just the means of inflating those dollars.
Yeah, I think if there's a number I worry about here, it's the 2% after the 1 or 3 year budget. It's not the 5-year rolling average that goes into just our budget window, as whether or not that becomes too conservative. But it's too early to tell, I think is fair. So that's really where I'd be focusing. And whenever we do a DC bylaw, and I know it's more up in the air than it used to be 2 weeks ago, I'm really interested in whether that's the right number in the inflator and then how we align, because I do have some concerns about where that goes. Audit committee did not, however, which I found interesting. So anyways, looking around the table, did I get this moved and seconded yet? Yes. So if there's no further questions, all those in favor? That's carried. That takes us to the ever-exciting world of investment reporting. We did all the things we were supposed to do, as I think what the report said, and earned all the money we could. Any questions on this item? Councillor Bodley?
Sorry, I'm asking a lot of questions today. Through you, Chair Henry. So as I was going through the list of all of the investments that we have, some of it was obvious, these are GICs. Some of them look like they are bonds, maybe. I'm wondering if maybe you can speak to, are any of these like a typical or traditional mutual fund?
Through you, Chair Henry. Mutual funds we invest in GICs, or guaranteed investment certificates. I don't have anything called a mutual fund within the investment envelope right now. But the majority of the portfolio are GICs and strip bonds. And strip bond is simply a bond that's compounding, and we get a higher rate of return because we get no investment income, cash paid over the term of the bond, and we get paid out at the end of the term, so the return typically is much higher than it would be for a regular bond.
So a follow-up, are we invested in the stock market broadly?
Through you, Chair Henry. The Municipal Act dictates what kind of investments we can make, and we cannot invest in stocks like equity. The only equity we can invest in is through the One Fund, and it has an equity bond, or not like portfolio or type investment that we invest in, but it's managed by them. But going out and buying like actual equity stocks on the stock market, we can't do that. That's not part of the kind of investments we can make.
Yeah, we stay away from the BRIEXs by rule, just in terms of how those go. Any other questions on this item? Can I get this moved and seconded? Mayor Jaworski, Councillor somebody, Councillor Bodley. All those in favor? That's carried. 2018 annual statement of development charges. These are also a sequence of reports all coming at once that we are prescribed to do. We have to do them by law. Any questions on the DC report? Seeing none, I'll look for a mover to receive. Councillor Veith, Mayor Jaworski, all those in favor? Carried. 2018 annual statement of increased density account and cash in lieu of parkland account. Some new reporting required here. Any questions on this item? Seeing none, looking for a mover. Councillor Hanmer, Councillor Vasic, all those in favor? That's carried. And our favorite, the 2019 tax adjustments prepared by Paul Hatinga. Any questions on tax adjustments? Councillor Bodley?
So just a quick, through you, Chair Henry, just a quick one. When I was looking through the adjustment for the Westmount Golf and Country Club, and there was a comment there about the fact that it's increasing incrementally to the property value, and there was a comment around perhaps we're going to have to look at our risk on this deferral in the future. So I'm curious, understanding a previous conversation that we had around other municipalities who look at low-income senior tax deferrals. Oftentimes in other municipalities, those are capped in Markham and Newmarket, for example, 75%. Do we need to build that into this agreement with Westmount Golf and Country Club in order to reduce our risk?
That's through you, Chair Henry. A very good question. The agreement is fairly prohibitive as it stands, and I believe it's only allowed to be terminated on mutual consent. We would obviously be interested in that mutual consent, but we would have to have two parties to agree to reopen it. Or sale of the golf course. We did drift down that road recently, and we did not have interest in reopening the agreement.
Looks like they had good lawyers. Councillor Vassar.
Thanks, through you, Chair Henry. This is now a new question, but I have another question. No interest from Westmount Golf and Country Club, or no interest from the City Council?
Through Westmount Golf Course.
Okay, great. Yeah, I mean, this might just be a totally moot point if there's no interest in having the conversation on their end. But, I mean, like, okay, say one day they sell it and someone buys it, then is it that the person who buys it has to pay those property taxes back? That's how it works?
With any, through you, Chair Henry, with any arrears account that we have, it's leaned against the property, and when the property is sold, the proceeds would pay for the residual.
And then what happens? Who then, if we know this information, who then kind of takes that on? So someone, let's say someone buys it, they build apartment buildings. Does that get factored into how much they're then selling the apartment buildings for example, or condos?
Through you, Chair Henry, any purchase decision on a property would be the vendor would make their case or business case to sell the property units for whatever the market would bear. I don't think obviously what you pay for the property would factor in, but the property would only be worth the market value that the market would bear. So the tax arrears wouldn't factor into the market value of the property.
They would.
The tax arrears do not factor into the market value of the property. If you bought a house with tax arrears on it, you wouldn't pay more for that house because there's tax arrears on it.
Okay. So I guess I'm just expressing public interest for doing everything we can to try to continue to have these conversations. Westmount Golf and Country Club, though I also play a sport that is financially inaccessible to many people. I play tennis, and I know golf is financially inaccessible. I have major concerns that they have this kind of break, given that it serves predominantly affluent people in this community. And so I would like to do everything we can to continue this conversation with them and see where we can go. I mean, $600,000, if I understand it correctly, is 1, 2, 3, 1, oh my gosh, because I'm nervous even saying this, like, I'm just trying to think of, I can usually do basic math, but it's not very many memberships, right? It's about 12 memberships at Westmount Golf and Country Club, so I think that should also be factored into beginning these conversations or ongoing.
Okay, thank you. Seeing nothing further on this item, need to receive this as information. Have I got that moved and seconded yet? No, I didn't think so. I haven't been doing that. Councillor Bodley, Councillor Freeman, all those in favor of receiving information? Carried. We have no consideration notice given in a previous meeting, no notice of motion at this meeting, no communications and correspondence here or at the region, no unfinished business from this agenda, but there is some new business. Mayor Jaworski.
Well, thank you very much. As all of our YouTube viewers have noticed today, there's a Siskins jersey displayed prominently at the front of the clerk's table there, and that is in honor of their major achievements this past this past season. So they're part of the Greater Ontario Junior Hockey League, and in that, the top honor is to win the Sutherland Cup, which Waterloo Siskins have won quite often in the 50s and 60s. Last won it in 1984. And the Siskins, they finished third during the regular season. The team moved into the playoffs and beat out Cambridge. They then beat out Stratford. They then beat out Listowel to win the Cherry Cup. They went on to beat Niagara Falls, and then went on to play the London Nationals. In Game 6, everything was tied up. In Game 7, they were tied the game with 4 minutes to go. And then in overtime, Waterloo scored. So we have an overtime win of the Sutherland Cup, which is something we haven't won in 25 years. There will be an end-of-year celebration tonight that I know Councillor Veith is joining me at, and I think a few others. And as well, we've worked with the Uptown BIA to turn the new tree lights into the Siskins colors, which are coincidentally Waterloo colors, and we'll celebrate that tonight. So I just wanted to offer congratulations on behalf of all of us on council to the Waterloo Siskins.
Indeed, I think in seeing the video from that winning overtime goal, throw the puck at the net. Just throw the puck at the net. Anything could happen, and wins are great. So great spirit by the team. No further new business. I have to look to the clerk to see what we need to do to make sure we go back in camera. We're fine? Okay, good. So we'll adjourn this meeting, and then we'll end up going back where we were. Look for a motion to adjourn. Councillor Hanmer, Councillor Vasek, all those in favor. We stand adjourned.